She needed her to move to economy class, not wanting to sit next to a black doctor. But just minutes later, karma hit for real when her son started choking. Find out how everything changed in an instant. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching this from. Dr. Jennifer Wilson sat quietly in the back seat of the taxi as it weaved through the busy streets leading to the airport. The hum of the engine blended with the faint jazz playing on the radio, creating a soothing background for her to reflect on the past week. As a well-respected physician specializing in emergency medicine, she had been invited to speak at a prestigious international medical conference, where she delivered a keynote speech on advanced emergency care techniques. It was a career milestone, one she had been working toward for years, but now all she wanted was a few hours of peace before her next shift back at the hospital. Jennifer sighed, glancing out the window at the terminal coming into view. Her body was heavy with exhaustion, but her mind still buzzed with the adrenaline from her presentation and the endless networking sessions. It had been a whirlwind of handshakes, panels, and polite smiles, but she couldn't wait to leave it all behind. A long flight home in first class felt like a well-deserved reward. She planned to finally relax, put on her noise-canceling headphones, and drift off to sleep as the plane cruised through the sky. As the taxi pulled up to the curb, Jennifer grabbed her bag and made her way through the sliding glass doors into the terminal. The sound of rolling suitcases and distant announcements filled the air, but she barely noticed. She was too focused on getting through security and to her gate. Traveling had always been a solitary experience for her, a chance to disconnect from the world, and she relished it. There was something about airports, the constant movement of people going to and from different places, that felt almost meditative. In a strange way, it allowed her to be anonymous, just another traveler among thousands. Jennifer made her way to the check-in counter, her ticket already pulled up on her phone. The airline attendant smiled at her, offering a polite, if somewhat mechanical, greeting. Within minutes, she had her boarding pass in hand and was directed to the security line for first-class passengers. The process was smooth, and soon she found herself wandering through the concourse searching for her gate. She caught a glimpse of herself in a shop window as she passed by, a reflection of a tall, elegant woman in her mid-30s, with smooth brown skin and short, tightly coiled hair styled in a neat pixie cut. Her professional attire, pressed slacks and a fitted blouse, spoke to her career as a physician, but there was an undeniable weariness in her eyes. It had been a long journey to where she was now, and although she carried herself with poise and confidence, the weight of years of overcoming obstacles, both personal and professional, was something she couldn't easily shed. As she reached her gate, Jennifer noticed a few other early arrivals seated nearby. She didn't pay them much mind, opting instead to take a seat by the window and check her phone for any last-minute emails. Her attention was drawn to a notification from her hospital, reminding her of the shift waiting for her the next morning. She grimaced slightly at the thought. The job never really let go, not even when she was miles away from her usual responsibilities. A soft voice over the intercom announced the start of boarding for first-class passengers, and Jennifer rose from her seat, walking toward the boarding door. The boarding agent scanned her ticket, and she entered the jet bridge, feeling a wave of relief as the noise of the airport faded behind her. Once on the plane, she was immediately greeted by the luxuries of first class: wide leather seats, complimentary drinks, and the kind of space that made you forget you were flying. A flight attendant greeted her warmly and helped her store her carry-on in the overhead bin. Jennifer smiled, feeling a sense of ease for the first time in days. She settled into her seat, grateful for the comfort. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let out a long, slow breath. Finally, she could unwind, but her brief moment of tranquility was interrupted when a small child's voice rang out from the aisle. Jennifer opened her eyes to see a young boy, no more than 7 or 8, fidgeting with his seatbelt. His mother, a tall, slender white woman, was fussing with their bags, clearly annoyed by something. Jennifer glanced around the cabin. There were only a few other passengers at this point, all quietly minding their own business. The boy, whose name she later learned was Luca, struggled with his seatbelt until Jennifer, unable to watch him struggle any longer, offered a kind smile. "Here, let me help," she said softly, reaching over and fastening it for him. Luca beamed up at her, but his mother barely acknowledged the gesture. Jennifer didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to the typical stress of traveling with a young child. But something about the woman's expression, a tightness around her mouth, a certain coldness in her eyes, struck her as odd. Shrugging it off, Jennifer leaned back in her seat, returning to her thoughts. As more passengers filed in, the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for takeoff. The usual safety announcements echoed through the speakers, and Jennifer found herself nodding off as the plane taxied down the runway. Just as her eyes fluttered closed, she heard a voice behind her, sharp, irritated. "I'm not flying with her sitting next to me." Jennifer's eyes snapped open. She sat up straighter, turning slightly to see who had spoken. It was Luca's mother, her face twisted in visible disgust. The flight attendant, caught off guard, seemed confused for a moment before responding in a calm, professional tone. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Is there a problem?" "Yes, there's a problem," the woman hissed. "I don't want to sit next to her." Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't the words themselves, but the venom with which they were spoken that left no room for ambiguity. She knew exactly what this was about. The woman's pointed glance in her direction confirmed it. This wasn't about seating arrangements or personal space. This was about race. For a split second, Jennifer considered confronting the woman, but she hesitated. Years of dealing with subtle and not so subtle racism had taught her that some battles weren't worth fighting. She glanced at the flight attendant, who looked just as uncomfortable as she felt. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant began, trying to defuse the situation. "We're fully booked in first class and all the seats are assigned." The woman crossed her arms, her voice rising. "Then move her to another seat. I'm not sitting next to someone like that. I paid for a first-class ticket, and I expect to be treated properly." Jennifer's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, but no one said anything. The flight attendant, clearly flustered, looked between Jennifer and the irate woman, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Jennifer took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had faced worse. This was just another instance of someone's ignorance, another hurdle she had to overcome. But even as she tried to brush it off, the sting of the words cut deeper than she expected. She hadn't asked for this. All she wanted was to get home in peace. The flight attendant, seeing no easy solution, turned to Jennifer with an apologetic expression. "Dr. Wilson, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. Would it be possible for you to—" Jennifer already knew what was coming, and the realization made her stomach twist. This wasn't the first time she'd been asked to make someone else comfortable at her own expense. It wouldn't be the last. For a moment, she wanted to refuse. She wanted to stand her ground and demand the respect she deserved. But she was tired, so tired. All she wanted was peace, and if moving to a different seat was the price she had to pay, maybe it wasn't worth fighting over. She could save her energy for more important battles. Without a word, Jennifer nodded and stood, collecting her things. The woman smirked, satisfied with the outcome, as Jennifer was guided toward the back of the plane. Each step felt heavier than the last, a reminder of the weight she carried every day as a black woman in spaces where she wasn't always welcome. As she settled into her new seat in economy, Jennifer leaned her head against the window, watching the runway blur as the plane finally took off. The gentle hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin as the plane ascended into the clouds, but Jennifer could barely hear it. The events that had just transpired weighed heavily on her, casting a shadow over the peaceful escape she had hoped for on this flight. The cramped seat in the economy class was a stark contrast to the luxurious first-class seat she had been in just moments ago. She stared out the window, the world outside a blur, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, strong, composed, but undeniably hurt. Jennifer had dealt with racism before, of course. As a successful black woman in the medical field, she had faced it in many forms: subtle slights, condescending remarks, and outright hostility. But this was different. The blatant rejection from Luca's mother, moved to the economy class simply because of the color of her skin, cut deeper than most of the incidents she had experienced. The humiliation was fresh, and the looks from other passengers only added to the sting. She tried to focus on her breathing, to calm the rising frustration in her chest. She couldn't let this get to her. Not now. She was a professional. She was better than this. But no matter how hard she tried, the bitterness of the moment clung to her, refusing to fade. Her thoughts drifted back to the woman in first class. Mavis Hendricks, the flight attendant, had mentioned her name when trying to defuse the situation. Even now, Jennifer could see her pale face twisted in disdain, the way she had looked at her as if she were less than human. The memory made her grit her teeth. Who was this woman to judge her? Who was she to decide who was worthy of sitting in first class? Jennifer closed her eyes and leaned back, trying to shake the resentment that threatened to take root. But even in her solitude, the weight of the injustice followed her. The flight attendant approached her quietly, crouching slightly to speak at eye level. "Dr. Wilson, I'm really sorry about what happened back there," she said, her voice a soft whisper as if to avoid drawing attention. "We don't tolerate that kind of behavior, but I didn't know what else to do." Jennifer opened her eyes and met the attendant's gaze. The young woman looked genuinely apologetic, her features lined with worry. Jennifer gave a small, forced smile, her voice calm but firm. "I understand. It's not your fault." The attendant seemed to relax a little, but the tension between them still hung in the air. She offered Jennifer a complimentary drink as a token of apology, but Jennifer waved it off politely. She wasn't in the mood for any more gestures, empty attempts to smooth over something that cut so deeply. After a few more moments of awkward silence, the attendant left, leaving Jennifer to her thoughts once again. Jennifer wasn't the type to let such things break her spirit. Her resilience had been forged over years of navigating a world where she often had to prove her worth more than others. But no matter how many times she endured situations like this, the emotional toll still added up. She could feel it now, the slow build of exhaustion, not just from the long conference, but from the relentless pressure of always being expected to rise above other people's hatred. In an effort to distract herself, Jennifer pulled out her phone and scrolled through her emails. Work was never far from her mind, and there were always things to catch up on. But even as she read through messages from colleagues and hospital staff, her mind wandered back to the woman and her son, Luca. There was something about the boy that lingered with her, despite the ugliness of the situation with his mother. His innocence, perhaps. His bright eyes and infectious curiosity had momentarily lightened her mood when she had helped him with his seatbelt. He hadn't seemed to notice the color of her skin at all, just grateful for the help. It made her wonder what he would think if he knew the real reason his mother had wanted her moved. Jennifer glanced toward the front of the plane, as if she could somehow see Luca through the rows of seats. She wondered how much influence his mother's hatred would have on him as he grew older, how many of her prejudices he would inherit. It was a thought that saddened her. Children weren't born hating anyone, they were taught it. And Luca, despite his innocent face, would one day have to decide what kind of person he would become. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter. Across the aisle, a group of young men in business suits were chatting, their voices loud and carefree. One of them glanced in her direction, his eyes lingering a little too long. Jennifer instinctively straightened in her seat, her fingers tightening around her phone. The man's gaze held a kind of smugness that immediately put her on edge. "Looks like someone had to trade in their first-class seat," one of the men muttered to his companion, not even bothering to lower his voice. The other man chuckled, shaking his head in mock sympathy. "Guess some people just don't belong up there, huh?" Jennifer's stomach churned. Her jaw clenched as she fought to keep her composure. She could feel her pulse quicken, the familiar rush of anger rising within her. It would be so easy to snap back, to unleash the torrent of frustration that had been building since she first boarded the plane. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath and turned away, staring out the window once more. It wasn't worth it. These men, just like Mavis Hendricks, weren't worth her time or energy. She had bigger battles to fight, battles that actually mattered. But no matter how hard she tried to push the anger aside, it simmered beneath the surface, refusing to be ignored. Jennifer knew she had to let it out somehow, but there was no outlet here, no space for her to release the pressure that had been building since the start of the flight. She thought of the countless microaggressions she had faced over the years, the times she had been underestimated, dismissed, or outright rejected because of her race. It was a lifetime of moments like this, small, insidious cuts that, on their own, might have been easy to brush off. But together they formed an undeniable wound, one that never seemed to fully heal. Jennifer's mind wandered to the hospital, to the patients she treated every day. There, her skin color didn't matter, at least not to the people whose lives she saved. In the emergency room, it was her skills that defined her, not her appearance. But outside the hospital, it was often the opposite. Here, on this plane, she was nothing more than another black woman to be judged and dismissed. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting her back to the present. She gripped the armrest, her heart pounding for a moment before the ride smoothed out again. It was a temporary distraction from the unease that had settled in her chest, but it wasn't enough. Jennifer reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook. Writing had always been a way for her to process her emotions, a way to put her thoughts into words when they felt too overwhelming. She opened the notebook to a blank page, the pen poised in her hand, but no words came. How could she even begin to describe what she was feeling? How could she capture the complexity of the pain, the frustration, the weariness? She wanted to write about resilience, about rising above, but at that moment, she didn't feel resilient. She felt tired of always being the one expected to stay calm, to stay composed, to take the high road. The voice of the flight attendant crackled over the intercom, announcing that the plane had reached cruising altitude and that passengers could now move about the cabin. Jennifer closed her notebook and tucked it back into her bag. She stood, stretching her legs slightly, and made her way toward the lavatory at the back of the plane. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel the eyes on her. Whether it was curiosity, judgment, or something else she couldn't say, but the feeling was there, lingering like an invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. When she reached the lavatory, Jennifer locked the door behind her and took a moment to breathe. The small, cramped space offered little comfort, but at least here, she was alone. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, her dark eyes searching for some sign of the strong, composed woman she knew she was. But all she saw was the exhaustion, the emotional toll of a lifetime of moments like this. She splashed some water on her face, hoping it would help clear her mind. But as she dried her hands on the rough paper towel, the thoughts came flooding back. The voices of the men across the aisle, the cold disdain in Mavis Hendricks' eyes, the silence of the other passengers as they watched it all unfold. When Jennifer returned to her seat, she noticed that the man who had made the rude comment earlier was now asleep, his head tilted back against the seat. His companion was quietly watching a movie, oblivious to her presence. For a brief moment, she considered saying something, anything, to confront them. But what good would it do? Jennifer sat back down, her thoughts racing. There was no easy solution, no quick fix for the kind of systemic prejudice she faced every day. But she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let them break her. Not today. Not ever. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, Jennifer found herself gazing out the window once more, her reflection fading into the clouds. The world outside seemed so vast, so full of possibilities. And despite everything, despite the pain and the anger, she knew there was still so much she had yet to accomplish. Jennifer tried her best to relax, but the uncomfortable seat in economy class made it nearly impossible. Her mind kept replaying the incident from earlier. Mavis Hendricks' hateful expression, the cruel words, and the flight attendant's helplessness. Each time Jennifer thought she could let it go, another wave of frustration hit her. She wasn't just angry at Mavis. She was angry at the system that allowed people like her to think they could act this way with impunity. The steady hum of the plane did little to soothe her nerves. Jennifer could feel the lingering eyes of the passengers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation. Even now, some glanced in her direction, their faces betraying curiosity, or worse, indifference. It was the silence that bothered her the most, the unspoken acceptance that what happened was just part of life. No one had stood up for her. No one had said a word. The weight of their collective inaction pressed heavily on her, deepening the wound. Suddenly, the plane hit another patch of turbulence, jolting everyone in their seats. Jennifer gripped the armrests, her muscles tensing involuntarily. She looked around and saw the businessmen across the aisle stirring slightly, exchanging casual glances as they shrugged off the minor discomfort. But her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the injustice of the situation. A sudden movement at the front of the cabin caught her attention. Mavis Hendricks had stood up from her seat, her face red with anger as she made her way toward the flight attendant who had helped Jennifer earlier. Jennifer watched as Mavis approached the attendant with the same venomous energy that had fueled their earlier exchange. "I thought I made it clear," Mavis hissed, her voice just loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. "I don't want that woman anywhere near my family. I can't believe she was even allowed in first class." The flight attendant, clearly uncomfortable, tried to remain professional. "Ma'am, I understand that you're upset, but Dr. Wilson is a valued passenger like anyone else. I'm sorry, but I can't." "I don't care who she is," Mavis snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "I won't have my son exposed to people like her. This is unacceptable." Jennifer's hands clenched into fists. She could hear the exchange clearly, even from her seat. The blood drained from her face as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't just about Mavis's personal dislike for her. This was about the woman's deep-seated racism, the kind that ran so deep that she felt entitled to say whatever she wanted, without fear of consequences. The flight attendant tried to calm Mavis down, her voice soothing but firm. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but we cannot discriminate against passengers based on—" "Discriminate?" Mavis interrupted, her voice rising even louder. "I'm not the one discriminating. She doesn't belong in first class, and I want to speak to your supervisor." By now, the entire cabin had taken notice. The tension in the air was palpable. The other passengers watched the scene unfold, their expressions ranging from discomfort to disinterest. Some shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but no one said anything. Jennifer felt the familiar tightness in her chest return, a mix of anger and exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. How many times had she been in situations like this? How many times had she been forced to sit quietly while people like Mavis said things they would never dare say to someone they saw as their equal? It was infuriating, but more than that, it was deeply demoralizing. She tried to breathe through the anger, but it wasn't easy. Every word Mavis uttered felt like another slap in the face, a reminder that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she achieved, people like Mavis would always see her as less. The flight attendant finally managed to steer Mavis back to her seat, though it was clear that the confrontation wasn't over. Mavis was seething, her face flushed with indignation, and Jennifer knew that this wasn't the end of it. Mavis would likely file a complaint, maybe even try to get the airline involved, all because she couldn't stand the thought of sitting near a black woman. As Mavis returned to her seat, Jennifer caught the eye of one of the business travelers across the aisle. He quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in the in-flight magazine in his hands, but the momentary glance was enough. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't going to intervene. No one was. Jennifer felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Of course, they wouldn't intervene. It was easier to stay silent, to look the other way, than to confront the ugliness of what was happening. Easier to pretend that this wasn't their problem. The flight continued in tense silence, the occasional jolt of turbulence the only break in the stillness. Jennifer tried to focus on something, anything, other than the suffocating feeling of isolation that had settled over her. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through her emails again, though the words on the screen blurred together. She couldn't concentrate, not with the weight of the situation pressing down on her like this. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft cry from the front of the plane. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the hum of the engines. But then it grew louder, more urgent, a child's cry, full of fear. Jennifer's head snapped up, her heart skipping a beat. She recognized that cry. It was Luca. Instinct took over as Jennifer stood from her seat, her eyes darting toward the front of the cabin. Luca was in distress. She could hear his mother's panicked voice trying to calm him, but something was wrong. Jennifer's training as a physician kicked in immediately. Without thinking, she began to make her way toward the first-class section, but as she approached, the flight attendant stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "I'm sorry, Dr. Wilson," the flight attendant said, her face tight with regret. "But I can't let you go up there." Jennifer's heart pounded in her chest. "That boy needs help," she said, her voice firm. "I'm a doctor. I can help him." The flight attendant looked torn, glancing between Jennifer and the first-class section where Luca's cries were growing louder. Jennifer could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to let her through, but the confrontation with Mavis earlier still hung over them both like a cloud. Jennifer's jaw clenched in frustration. "Look, I don't care about the seat or the class. That child needs medical attention, and I'm the only doctor on board. Let me help him." The flight attendant hesitated for a moment longer before finally stepping aside. "Okay," she said softly. "Please, go ahead." Jennifer didn't waste another second. She moved quickly up the aisle, her mind already running through possible scenarios. She had no idea what was wrong with Luca, but she had to be prepared for anything. The cries grew louder as she approached, and when she reached the boy's seat, she saw Mavis, pale and frantic, trying desperately to calm her son. Luca's face was flushed, his small chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. Jennifer's eyes immediately scanned the situation. It was clear that Luca was in distress. His labored breathing and wide eyes suggested some kind of respiratory issue, possibly an asthma attack or an allergic reaction. Without waiting for permission, Jennifer knelt beside Luca's seat and gently placed her hand on his forehead. His skin was clammy and his pulse was racing. "I'm a doctor," she said, addressing Mavis directly for the first time. "I need to know if he has any medical conditions. Does he have asthma? Any allergies?" Mavis's eyes were wide with fear, and for a moment she seemed too shocked to speak. But then, as if realizing that Jennifer was his only hope, she nodded quickly. Yes, he has asthma. I think he left his inhaler in the car. Oh God, I don't know what to do." Jennifer's heart sank. An asthma attack at 30,000 feet without an inhaler was a serious situation. They had to act quickly. "Okay," Jennifer said calmly, her training taking over. "We don't have time to wait. I need you to help me keep him calm. The more panicked he gets, the harder it will be for him to breathe. Do you understand?" Mavis nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for Luca's hand. Jennifer took a deep breath and quickly assessed the situation. Without an inhaler, they had to find another way to get his breathing under control. She stood and turned toward the flight attendant who was hovering nearby. "I need you to bring me any oxygen you have on board, as well as some warm water and a towel." The flight attendant rushed off without hesitation, and Jennifer returned her focus to Luca. "Hey, buddy," she said gently, kneeling beside him once more. "I'm here to help, okay? I know it's scary, but I need you to take slow, deep breaths with me. Can you do that?" Luca nodded weakly, his wide eyes filled with fear. Jennifer took his hand, giving him a reassuring squeeze as she demonstrated how to breathe slowly and steadily. Despite his panic, Luca tried his best to follow her lead, his small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Within moments, the flight attendant returned with a small oxygen tank and mask. Jennifer worked quickly, attaching the mask to Luca's face and adjusting the flow of oxygen. His breathing began to slow, though it was still labored. Jennifer stayed by his side, monitoring his condition closely. As she worked, Jennifer could feel Mavis's eyes on her. The hostility that had been so sharp just moments ago was now replaced with something else: fear, desperation, and perhaps a glimmer of gratitude. Jennifer remained kneeling beside Luca as the oxygen mask helped regulate his breathing. Each shallow breath he took was slightly less strained than the last, but she knew that without an inhaler, they were walking a fine line. Asthma attacks were unpredictable, and at 30,000 feet, with no immediate access to more advanced medical care, things could still take a dangerous turn. The flight attendant hovered nearby, waiting for any further instructions. Mavis, still visibly shaken, gripped Luca's hand tightly, her earlier arrogance and disdain replaced by a palpable fear. Jennifer could feel the tension radiating from her, but now wasn't the time to address the underlying issues between them. Right now, the boy's life was her primary concern. Jennifer gently adjusted the oxygen mask on Luca's face and spoke softly to him. "You're doing great, buddy. Just keep breathing slowly, okay? You're safe." Luca nodded weakly, his eyes wide and scared, but he seemed to trust her. That was all she needed. Keeping him calm was crucial, especially given the high altitude and the limited medical resources on the plane. Jennifer looked up at Mavis, who was staring at her son, her face pale and lined with worry. "He's stabilizing," Jennifer said in a calm, professional tone, hoping to reassure the frantic mother. "But we need to make sure he stays calm, and we'll continue giving him oxygen until we land. If his condition worsens, we'll need to prepare for an emergency landing." Mavis's hands shook as she clutched Luca's small hand in her own. She glanced at Jennifer, her expression filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. I can't believe I left his inhaler," she stammered. "I'm usually so careful. What if something happens to him?" Jennifer could sense the panic rising in Mavis, and she knew that any further escalation of stress could negatively affect Luca. His breathing had become more regular, but it was still fragile, and stress could easily send him spiraling into another episode. She decided to focus on maintaining calm in the situation, even as the stakes remained high. "We're doing everything we can right now," Jennifer reassured her, her voice steady. "The oxygen is helping, and we'll keep monitoring him. The key is to stay calm, both for Luca's sake and for yours." Mavis nodded, swallowing hard. Her eyes were rimmed with tears, and for the first time since Jennifer had met her, she seemed vulnerable. No longer the indignant, entitled woman who had demanded Jennifer's removal from first class. Now, she was just a mother, terrified for her child's life. As Jennifer continued to tend to Luca, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. The entire first-class section had gone silent, the atmosphere tense. She could sense the shift in their perception. No longer just the black woman who had been moved to economy. She was now the person saving a child's life. It was a shift that wasn't unfamiliar to Jennifer. Time and again, she had found herself in situations where her competence and expertise were only acknowledged when someone needed her skills. It was as though her value as a person was only recognized when it served someone else's immediate need. Jennifer's focus remained on Luca, but she could hear the faint whispers from behind her, the subtle murmurings of the passengers who had witnessed the entire incident. She wondered how they were interpreting the scene now. Did they see the irony? Did they realize how quickly someone's worth could be redefined when life was on the line? She pushed those thoughts aside, knowing they would only serve to distract her from the task at hand. There would be time for reflection later. Right now, her priority was making sure Luca stayed stable until they landed. Jennifer glanced out the window, mentally calculating how long it would be until the flight reached its destination. They were still hours away from their landing, and while Luca was responding to the oxygen, the lack of his inhaler meant they were relying entirely on temporary measures to keep him stable. If his condition worsened, they would have no choice but to divert the plane and make an emergency landing. She looked back at Mavis. The woman's eyes were locked on her son, but there was a visible tension in her body, a mix of terror and helplessness. Jennifer could sense Mavis's struggle with her own emotions, not just fear for her child, but something deeper, a recognition of her own guilt and complicity. Jennifer gently placed her hand on Luca's shoulder, keeping her voice low and soothing. "Luca, you're doing amazing, okay? Just keep taking slow, deep breaths. We're going to get through this." The boy nodded weakly, his breathing steadier now, though still slightly labored. His mother, though visibly shaken, seemed to find some measure of comfort in Jennifer's calm presence. Mavis's tears flowed silently down her cheeks as she watched her son, fear and helplessness mixing with something Jennifer couldn't quite define, perhaps a sense of remorse for how she had treated Jennifer earlier. Jennifer felt a tug in her chest at the sight. Mavis, in her panic and desperation, was no longer the hostile figure from earlier. Fear had stripped away her layers of prejudice, leaving a mother who was desperate to see her child survive. But the damage had been done, and Jennifer wasn't naive enough to think that a single moment of crisis would erase years of ingrained bias. As Luca's breathing continued to stabilize, Jennifer sat back slightly, allowing herself a moment to process the situation. The flight attendant returned with a blanket and a few more supplies in case they needed them. Jennifer gave her a grateful nod before turning back to Mavis. "We'll keep giving him oxygen," Jennifer explained, her voice calm and methodical. "But if anything changes, if his breathing gets worse again, we need to alert the captain immediately for an emergency landing." Mavis swallowed hard, her eyes wide. "Do you think he'll be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I've never seen him like this before. I don't know what I'd do if—" Jennifer cut her off gently. "He's doing better now, and we're taking all the right steps. But asthma attacks can be unpredictable, especially without the right medication. I'll stay with him and monitor his condition closely. If anything changes, we'll be ready." Mavis nodded, her lips pressed tightly together as she struggled to hold back her tears. She looked down at her son, her hand gently stroking his hair. The contrast between her earlier hostility and the vulnerability she now displayed was stark. Jennifer could see the conflict within her. Mavis had judged Jennifer harshly just an hour ago, but now her son's life was in the hands of the very person she had belittled. For a moment, the tension between them seemed to hang in the air, unspoken but palpable. Jennifer could feel it. The weight of Mavis's prejudice, her guilt, and the unspoken apology that lingered between them. But Jennifer wasn't interested in apologies. She wasn't doing this for validation or forgiveness. She was here to save Luca, and that was all that mattered. As the minutes stretched into hours, Jennifer remained by Luca's side, monitoring his breathing and making sure the oxygen continued to flow. The plane's steady hum and the soft murmur of the passengers were the only sounds that filled the air. Mavis occasionally glanced at Jennifer, her expression a mixture of gratitude and lingering discomfort. Jennifer could feel the shift in the atmosphere around them. The passengers, who had remained silent during the earlier conflict, were now watching her with something resembling respect. It was a familiar feeling, the sudden recognition that came when people realized her competence and value, but only after they needed something from her. Despite the tension, Jennifer remained focused. She wasn't here to change anyone's mind about who she was or what she was capable of. She was here to help Luca, and as long as the boy was stable, that was all that mattered. After what felt like hours, Jennifer finally allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Luca's breathing had steadied, and though he was still weak, his condition was no longer critical. She glanced at Mavis, who was watching her with a mixture of awe and guilt. "Thank you," Mavis whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Jennifer looked at her face calm but unreadable. "I'm just doing my job," she replied quietly, the weight of the words carrying more meaning than the simple phrase suggested. Mavis opened her mouth to say something more, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. She looked away, her face flushed with emotion. Jennifer turned her attention back to Luca, not pressing the issue. There was no need to delve into the complex emotions swirling between them right now. The situation was still fragile, and there would be time to address those feelings later, if at all. As the plane continued its journey toward its destination, Jennifer remained by Luca's side, her mind a mix of calm determination and the quiet storm of thoughts she had learned to manage over years of similar encounters. Prejudice had no place in the work she did, no place in the lives she saved, but it was always there, lingering in the corners of her existence, shaping the way others saw her. For now, though, she focused on the task at hand. Luca was stable. The flight would land soon, and emergency medical staff would be waiting to take over. Jennifer would step off the plane as just another passenger, but the experience would linger with her as they always did. She sat back slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing as the situation came under control. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. The conflict between her and Mavis had not been fully resolved. As the plane continued its descent, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained tense but quiet. Jennifer sat by Luca's side, her hands resting lightly on her knees as she monitored his breathing, which had thankfully remained steady. The rhythmic sound of the engines filled the cabin, but beneath that there was a current of unspoken tension, one that had nothing to do with the turbulence in the air and everything to do with the complex dynamics between Jennifer and Mavis Hendricks. Luca had drifted off to sleep, the oxygen mask still gently covering his small face, while Mavis sat silently beside him, her eyes never leaving her son. It was as if the intensity of the situation had drained all the fire out of her. The woman who had so loudly demanded Jennifer be removed from first class now sat humbled, her earlier arrogance replaced by something far more fragile: fear, vulnerability, and perhaps a growing awareness of the consequences of her actions. Jennifer, for her part, had maintained her professionalism throughout the ordeal, pushing her personal feelings aside to focus solely on Luca's well-being. But now, with the immediate crisis over, the full weight of what had transpired began to sink in. Her mind returned to the confrontation that had started all of this. Mavis's hateful words, the way the other passengers had looked on without intervening, and how Jennifer had been forced to leave her rightful seat simply to avoid further conflict. She had felt humiliated, but she hadn't fought back. She had walked away because that's what society often expected her to do: keep quiet, keep composed, and rise above it all. But now, as the plane neared its destination, Jennifer could feel the shift in the air. It wasn't just the altitude dropping. It was the realization that this moment, this entire ordeal had revealed something deeper about who she was and what she represented. She had chosen to help despite the prejudice she'd faced, to rise above the ignorance and hatred, and now she knew that it was time for the truth to come to light. The intercom crackled to life, and the pilot's voice echoed through the cabin, announcing that they would soon be landing. "We'll be touching down in about 15 minutes, the pilot said. "Flight attendants, please prepare for landing." Jennifer glanced out the window at the clouds parting to reveal the city below. The end of the journey was near, but there was still unfinished business in the air between her and Mavis. Mavis, who had remained silent for most of the flight, finally spoke, her voice trembling with exhaustion and guilt. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her eyes still fixed on her sleeping son. Jennifer looked at her, her expression calm but unreadable. "He's stable for now," she replied. "Once we land, the paramedics will take over and they'll give him the proper treatment. You'll need to make sure he has his inhaler with him at all times from now on." Mavis nodded slowly, her fingers still gripping Luca's hand as if she couldn't bear to let go. There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her tone thick with emotion. "I was so wrong. About you. About everything." Jennifer didn't respond immediately. She could see the conflict in Mavis's eyes, the internal struggle of a woman forced to confront her own deeply ingrained prejudices. It wasn't the first time Jennifer had seen that look, but it was always difficult to know whether the remorse was genuine or simply a result of the crisis. People often change their tune when their lives, or the lives of their loved ones, depended on the very people they had previously judged or dismissed. "I didn't help him because I needed your gratitude," Jennifer finally said, her voice steady but firm. "I helped him because he needed me. That's what I do. I'm a doctor, and when someone's life is at risk, it doesn't matter who they are or what they think of me. It's my job to save lives." Mavis's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she looked as though she might break down completely. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she simply nodded, her gaze dropping to her lap as she struggled to contain the overwhelming emotions swirling inside her. Jennifer could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, watching this exchange unfold. The same people who had sat in silence while Mavis insulted her now seemed to be seeing her in a new light. The unspoken tension that had filled the cabin earlier was still present, but now it was mixed with something else. Respect, perhaps, or at least a recognition that Jennifer was not the person Mavis had tried to make her out to be. Jennifer wasn't one to seek validation from others, but in this moment, she knew that what she was about to say needed to be heard by everyone in that cabin, not just Mavis. "You may have judged me based on how I look," Jennifer said, her voice calm but resonant enough to carry through the quiet first-class section. "But what you didn't know is that I'm not just another passenger. I'm Dr. Jennifer Wilson, and I've spent years saving lives in some of the most difficult conditions imaginable. I've led emergency teams, performed life-saving surgeries, and been recognized for my contributions to medicine. I didn't get to where I am today by luck or chance. I worked hard for everything I have." She let her words hang in the air for a moment, watching as the realization slowly dawned on Mavis and on the other passengers who had overheard the conversation. The truth of who Jennifer was, her accomplishments, and her expertise was now laid bare for all to see. No longer just the black woman they had seen as an inconvenience, Jennifer stood before them as someone who had not only proven her worth, but had done so with grace and integrity. Mavis's face crumpled, her tears flowing freely now. She looked up at Jennifer with a mixture of shame and gratitude, her voice breaking as she spoke. I didn't know," she stammered, her hands trembling as she wiped away her tears. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't realize." Jennifer's gaze softened slightly, though her expression remained composed. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect," she said quietly. Everyone deserves that, regardless of their race, status, or occupation. Mavis lowered her head again, her sobs quiet but unmistakable. Jennifer could see the deep shame etched into the woman's features, but she didn't press further. It wasn't her responsibility to fix Mavis's conscience. That was something Mavis would have to grapple with on her own. The flight attendant, who had been standing nearby during the entire exchange, stepped forward cautiously, her face filled with a mixture of sympathy and admiration for Jennifer. "Dr. Wilson," she said softly, "the paramedics will be waiting as soon as we land. They'll make sure Luca gets the care he needs." Jennifer nodded, grateful for the professional support. "Thank you," she replied. "I'll stay with him until they arrive." The plane began its final descent, the cabin filling with the familiar sensations of landing, the slight dip in altitude, the subtle shift in pressure. Jennifer remained calm, her attention still focused on Luca, but the tension from earlier had dissipated. The situation had reached its climax, and now, as the ground neared, there was a sense of resolution in the air. As the wheels of the plane touched down, the passengers around Jennifer began to gather their things, but there was a noticeable difference in their behavior. No one looked at her with disdain or dismissal anymore. There was a newfound respect in their eyes, an acknowledgement of who she was and what she had done. They had seen her not only as a black woman, but as a doctor, a lifesaver, and a person who had risen above prejudice to do what was right. Mavis remained silent as the plane taxied to the gate, her face pale and drawn. She didn't say another word, but her expression spoke volumes. Jennifer could see the turmoil in her eyes, the guilt, the shame, and perhaps the beginning of a new understanding. Whether that understanding would lead to real change remained to be seen, but for now, it was enough that Mavis had been forced to confront the consequences of her actions. As the plane came to a stop, the flight attendants moved quickly to assist with the medical situation. The paramedics were already waiting on the tarmac, and within moments they were boarding the plane, ready to take over. Jennifer stood back as they carefully assessed Luca's condition. He was still stable, thanks to the oxygen and the calming measures she had taken, but they would need to transport him to the hospital for further treatment. One of the paramedics approached Jennifer, his face serious but grateful. "You did a great job, Doctor," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "You probably saved this boy's life." Jennifer gave a small nod, her expression neutral. "I'm just glad I was here when he needed help," she replied. "He's going to be okay, right?" The paramedic smiled reassuringly. "He's in good hands now. We'll make sure he gets the care he needs." With that, the paramedics carefully placed Luca on a stretcher and began the process of escorting him and Mavis off the plane. Mavis glanced back at Jennifer one last time, her eyes filled with an emotion that was difficult to read. Jennifer met her gaze, but didn't say anything. There was nothing more to say. As the paramedics left, Jennifer finally allowed herself to exhale. The weight of the day's events settled over her, but she didn't feel defeated. She had faced prejudice, risen above it, and done what she had always done: saved a life, no matter the circumstances. As the passengers slowly filed out of the plane, a few of them nodded to her in acknowledgement. Some murmured words of thanks, others simply offered a respectful glance. The shift in their behavior was subtle, but it was there. Jennifer had made an impression, one that they wouldn't soon forget. And as she gathered her things and prepared to disembark, she knew that she had once again proven what she had always known, that her worth wasn't defined by the color of her skin, but by the integrity of her actions. The terminal was bustling with activity as passengers from Jennifer's flight disembarked. The sound of rolling luggage, hurried footsteps, and announcements over the loudspeaker filled the air, but to Jennifer, everything felt distant, almost muted. The emotional and physical toll of the flight weighed heavily on her, but a quiet sense of resolution had settled within her as she made her way through the terminal. Luca had been taken to a nearby hospital for further treatment, and Jennifer knew that he would be okay now. Her focus, however, had shifted. The events on the plane had exposed something much deeper than a medical emergency. It had revealed the stark reality of prejudice and how it could influence even the most mundane situations, like a simple flight home. As Jennifer walked toward the exit, she noticed that several of the passengers from first class were still lingering nearby, waiting for their luggage or perhaps for a ride. They glanced in her direction, some offering nods of recognition or quick smiles. There was an unspoken acknowledgement in the air, as if the entire ordeal had left a lasting impression on everyone involved. For many of them, the flight had likely been a jarring wake-up call, a reminder that their assumptions about people, about race, were often based on nothing but ignorance. But Jennifer wasn't interested in their newfound respect. She wasn't here to seek validation from strangers. Her focus remained on what mattered, standing firm in her identity, her professionalism, and her integrity. As she neared the exit, she heard her name being called. "Dr. Wilson, wait!" Jennifer turned to see Mavis Hendricks hurrying toward her, her face flushed and her steps unsteady. The weight of the day's events was written all over her, the exhaustion, the fear for her son's health, and the guilt that had been simmering since the confrontation on the plane. Mavis stopped in front of Jennifer, breathing heavily, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of emotions, shame, gratitude, and something else Jennifer couldn't quite place. The proud, haughty woman from earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked fragile, almost broken. "Dr. Wilson," Mavis began, her voice shaking, I don't even know where to start. I wanted to thank you again for what you did for Luca. You saved his life, and I don't deserve to even ask for your forgiveness after the way I treated you." Jennifer looked at her, her face calm and composed, though she could feel the weight of Mavis's words. This was the moment Jennifer had known would come, the moment when Mavis would have to face the consequences of her actions, not in the form of punishment, but in the form of acknowledgement. It wasn't just about apologizing for her words on the plane. It was about confronting the prejudice that had driven her to act that way in the first place. "You don't owe me gratitude, Mrs. Hendricks," Jennifer said softly, her tone measured but firm. "You owe it to yourself to understand why you reacted the way you did. What happened on that plane wasn't just about me. It was about the way you see people who don't look like you. And that's something you need to reflect on." Mavis blinked, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she stood there, silent, grappling with the truth of what Jennifer had just said. Jennifer took a small breath and continued, her voice even, but carrying the weight of years of experience. "People like me face situations like that every day. We're judged before we're even known. You didn't know who I was, what I've accomplished, or what I've done with my life. All you saw was the color of my skin, and you decided that I didn't belong." Mavis nodded slowly, her lips trembling as she fought to hold back her emotions. I was wrong," she whispered. "I was so wrong." Jennifer studied her for a moment, searching for sincerity in her words. There was no joy in watching someone break under the weight of their own guilt. But Jennifer knew that this moment of realization, of reckoning, was necessary. Mavis would have to confront her own biases, not just in this instance, but moving forward in her life. Change wouldn't come overnight, but perhaps this incident would spark something in her, something that could lead to genuine growth. "I'm not here to punish you, Mrs. Hendricks," Jennifer said, her voice softening slightly, "but it's important that you understand the impact of your actions. The world isn't as divided as people like to think. We all have a role to play in breaking down the barriers that keep us apart." Mavis wiped her eyes quickly, her face a mixture of shame and relief. She looked as though she wanted to say something more, but instead she simply nodded, accepting the weight of Jennifer's words. For a moment they stood in silence, the busy terminal bustling around them, but the world seemed to have paused for the two women. It was a moment of reckoning, a brief but powerful confrontation between the past and the possibility of change. "I will think about what you've said," Mavis finally managed to say, her voice shaky but determined. "I promise I will." Jennifer nodded, sensing the sincerity in Mavis's tone. "I hope you do," she replied, "for your sake and for Luca's." With that, the conversation came to an end. Mavis gave Jennifer one last, tearful glance before turning and walking away, her steps slow and deliberate as she headed toward the hospital where her son was being treated. Jennifer watched her go, a mixture of emotions stirring within her. She wasn't naive enough to believe that one conversation would change Mavis's entire worldview, but it was a start. Jennifer turned toward the exit once again, her steps purposeful as she walked through the automatic doors and into the fresh air outside the terminal. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the day's events lift ever so slightly as she stepped away from the confined space of the airport. She wasn't looking for praise or accolades. She didn't need validation from the passengers on that flight or from Mavis. What mattered most to Jennifer was that she had done what she always did: saved a life, stood tall in the face of adversity, and maintained her dignity throughout it all. As Jennifer hailed a taxi, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The world was full of people like Mavis, people who, for one reason or another, carried prejudice in their hearts. And yet, Jennifer knew that her role wasn't to change everyone she encountered. Her role was to lead by example, to be the best version of herself, and to continue breaking down barriers one day at a time. As the taxi pulled up and she slid into the back seat, Jennifer closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the hum of the city wash over her. It had been a long day, but she felt a sense of peace, knowing that she had done what was right, not just for Luca, but for herself. The driver asked where she was headed, and Jennifer gave the address of her home. She leaned back in her seat as the car pulled away from the terminal, her thoughts drifting back to the hospital and the patients she would soon be caring for. Tomorrow, she would be back in her element, saving lives without question, without judgment. And as she watched the city skyline pass by through the window, Jennifer knew one thing for certain. Her worth was not defined by anyone else's prejudice or bias. It was defined by the choices she made, the lives she touched, and the integrity she carried with her every step of the way. Justice had been restored, not through punishment or revenge, but through resilience, compassion, and truth. And in the end, that was what mattered most. As the city lights blurred past, Jennifer allowed herself a small smile. The world was changing, slowly perhaps, but changing nonetheless. and she would continue to be part of that change, one step at a time. The end. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new exciting stories. Give us a like, leave a comment. It really helps the development of the channel. And be sure to check out our other videos where you will find even more dramatic and touching stories. Click on the next video. I'm sure you'll be interested.